when, as a university teacher, I was so often frustrated by the non-appearance of a student who was due to lead the seminar. There was always the same alibi. "Oh, I think she's been to medical centre, sir," was the invariable excuse offered by the other students. But was she really sick? No, she's been to the medical centre. That was that. End of story. Well, a new book places the question, who is really sick, at the heart of a densely researched investigation into the various ways in which the British state has sought to determine genuine illness. It's entitled Sick Note, A History of the British Welfare State. And its author, who now joins me, is Gareth Millward, who's Assistant Professor at the University of Southern Denmark. Gareth, before we discuss the history of the sick note, let's begin with the definition, shall we? You suggest there's a difference between sickness in a cultural sense and sickness as a bureaucratic concept. And what do you mean exactly?
There's a difference between how you feel, or even how a doctor might call you sick or not. You know, you might have a cold, you might have a leg that isn't working quite how you would want to. But then there's also, on this other hand, this bureaucratic definition. So are you sick in terms of whether you qualify for benefits, whether you are allowed to take time off work, whether you're allowed to claim sick pay?
There's a long history of people providing evidence of sickness to avoid their obligations. Tell me a little bit about that history.
Catherine Foxtall's written an excellent book about migraines, where she talks in that book about people who have written letters to their friends and said, "I'm terribly sorry that I couldn't come to town for this occasion that I was supposed to go to, but I've had a migraine, I couldn't make it." There's been a long, long history of people having medical reasons why they haven't been able to do their job. But for sort of everyday people, this has really become more of an issue since the growth of industrialization and the growth of people needing to earn a wage. So if everybody has to work, and if you do have a good reason for not working, you need some way of bringing some money into the house. And so the sick note became this kind of shorthand for that, because it was generally agreed, well, if a doctor says that you're ill, or if our sick visitors come to see you and can see that you're ill, then you'll be genuine. And if you can't pass those tests, then you're not genuine and you don't get those benefits.
You were arguing, of course, the sick note. I mean, we first became aware of it in the context of the welfare state, and I mean, it was really designed in those terms, in those historical times, for white male breadwinners. Expand on that.
The idea is that people basically live in nuclear families, and you'll grow up in one, you'll then leave the house and form your own, and then you'll get old and you'll die. And the idea being that basically that is financed through the male breadwinner, and so he is the one that is insured against sickness, unemployment and old age, which in theory kind of works with this kind of view of society. But of course, the nuclear family has never been the only way that people have lived. So you've got the sick note there, which is used as a way of allowing people to get access to sickness-related benefit. You have to have a national insurance record. And for married women and for people who have not spent their entire working lives in the UK, that becomes quite a difficult problem. And for disabled people as well, who maybe don't have that kind of long-term employment record to be able to qualify for these kind of benefits.
I've got a reading here from the Lancet. This is back in 1947. It's a GP summing up how things were seen at the very birth of the NHS.
Certification is the crux of the problem. The government is going to control the doctor, because if the doctor were not controlled, he might be lax or dishonest, or worse still, he might treat his patients with kindness and humanity. And who defines satisfactory certification? The Minister of Health and his officials. Perhaps when a production drive is in progress, the Minister of Labour may arrange a further tightening up of certification.
What does that reading illustrate about doctors' concerns about medical certification?
Doctors have always been worried that if they are the only ones that are allowed to write sick notes, that effectively the state is going to coerce them into signing off as many people as possible as fit to work, because that benefits the state in the short term, at least, in lower benefit payments, and it benefits employers in the short term, at least, in people actually turning up for work. Obviously, in the long run, it could mean that people end up working through illness and then becoming more exhausted and having more time off later, but that's by the by. So that was in 1947, I believe. So this is exactly the time where the NHS is about to come in, and there are a lot of doctors that are really worried that if they are basically employed by the state will dictate their relationship to their patient, not the usual doctor-patient relationship. But there were people, politicians, particularly in the 1940s when the NHS was being set up, who were arguing that actually doctors are too nice to their patients. They're going to sign them off sick. We've usually ended up coming back towards maybe there's some inefficiency there, but actually the doctor probably is the most logical person to be doing this, and it kind of works in most circumstances.
I'm so interested in the changes in sick note policy.
It really changes in the 1980s, where the Thatcher government, reasonably in terms of the bureaucracy of it, said, why are people applying for a national insurance benefit from a national insurance office and getting some money from their employer? Why don't we just merge the whole thing and get the employers to do it? And that's what statutory sick pay eventually became. So at that point, the government has less reason to ask for short-term sick notes. And so the policies changed to allow people to just phone in and for up to a week and say, look, I'm sick, I can't come in. And that generally, again, seems to work because you can't really prove that somebody had a 2-day cold. You know, you're not going to do the lab tests on that. But because of that, there's been a lot more focus on long-term sickness and focus from employers using their own systems for determining whether somebody is taking, in their view, too many days off work.
The very phrase sick note, that's become a sort of shorthand term for all kinds of anxieties and debates in British society. The tabloid constantly writing of sick note Britain, the idea the nation was absolutely teeming with malingerers.
Yes, this idea that, okay, well, they've been able to pass the tests, but are they really sick? Could they not be doing more? The thing that really turned me onto this, I mean, probably because I'm a white man of a certain age, it was Darren Anderton, who was always called Sick Note, the footballer.
Yes, the Spurs footballer.
That was the kind of the rhetoric that fans were using. And you notice it used for all sorts of other people. Stephen Fry, for example, when he went missing from the play Cellmate, the term sick note was thrown around a lot there.
You talk about the way in which from the 1980s the sickness system got gradually privatised.
Well, the original plan for sickness benefits had been that you would claim them as a national insurance benefit. And that worked for quite a lot of people. And it worked because it meant that you were getting your money from the government, not from your employer necessarily. So it helped for people that maybe didn't have an occupational sick pay scheme, which in the 1940s was most sort of industrial workers. But it also meant that there was an independent tribunal system for judging whether somebody was sick or not. And that kind of worked for industrial relations because it meant the employers didn't have to make themselves seem to be the bad guy. And the employees knew that they had the protection of having that kind of third party kind of arbiter. But when you get rid of that national insurance system, you know, the working world has changed. Most employers by this point now do offer occupational sick pay. If you're going to make the employers pay the sick pay, then you lose that national insurance benefit, but you also lose that national insurance tribunal system. And so it ends up becoming privatized in that it becomes solely an issue of you proving to your employer that you are sick, rather than proving to the government that you're sick and then that information being passed on to the employer.
Let's move to 1982, because we got lobbying from the BMA, the doctors' organisation. People were now allowed to sign off work for the first week without a doctor's note. What was happening here?
Well, partially this was the BMA being quite canny, and they knew that if you were going to start privatising this sort of sick pay system, they could argue, oh, well, under our terms and conditions, we have to do this work for the state. It doesn't say we have to do it for employers. So they were kind of using that as a sort of a bargaining chip. But they'd been making a very, very good point for quite a long time, and that is you can't actually prove most short-term sicknesses. There's no scientific reason why a doctor should have to write that note. There's nothing gained other than forcing a worker to jump through the hoop of getting the note.
I think Peter Lilly, the Tory welfare secretary at the time, fueled tabloids with talk of closing down a something-for-nothing society and ending bad back benefits.
Yes, the bad back benefits. Well, this came at a time where the Conservative government was looking to cut the welfare bill. It had increased quite significantly, partially because of an ageing population. There were just simply more pensioners around in the 1990s than there had been in the 1950s, but also there'd been a massive increase in unemployment, and unemployed people who are sick tend to claim disability benefits. So what it looked like, if you just look at the headline figures of what's going on in the welfare state, it seems like disability benefits have exploded. And what could be causing that? Well, people like Peter Lilly would say it's people who are claiming bad back benefits and they're not really as sick as they say they are. Whereas for others, they would point to the rising amount of unemployment and economic inactivity, particularly in the deindustrialized areas of the country, and would point to more wider macroeconomic reasons why that was happening.
You talk about the ways in which firms started to introduce new disciplinary procedures to check up on their workers. You talk about this being a bit of a paradox.
The whole thing is about paradox because it's all about who's proving to who and where is the pressure coming from. Is it the patient who is having to make this real sort of demand for their rights, or is it the employer trying to enforce them coming to work? And that paradox is constantly there. So yes, on the one hand, I think employers, at least this is what the historical record seems to show, they were sort of broadly willing to let people phone in sick for a day or two. But at the same time, when people are on longer term sickness and now those employers are more responsible for more of that wage, they're starting to think, if this keeps happening, my premiums are going to go up. What can I do to get more people back into work? You start to see a rise in this kind of consultancy industry, really, of people talking about all the things that you can do to protect your employees' well-being, to help them get back to work quicker and to stay at work for longer. That is then combined as well with employment practices changing. There's fewer and fewer people having to do the same, if not more work. And as workplaces get leaner, making efficiency savings, it's less and less tolerable for somebody to take 3 weeks off work, because if that person goes, there's nobody to do that job and they need somebody in. So you need to keep people at work as much as you possibly can.
And in this environment, you talk about the sick note becoming suspect again. There's talk of scroungers and what they can do about it with New Labour.
The way that they try to soften that rhetoric, in part to placate the left of their party, and in part, I think, because this third way kind of economics, was that they would try and use these kind of functioning tests as a way back into work for people who had got sick. And so the idea was that you'd be put in some kind of group where you'd get work interviews and you'd work with your local job centre to find what kind of work was suitable for you. That works for the government because it gets people off the unemployment statistics. It works as well because you can reduce the amount of benefits that you're paying if people are also earning through private industry. And this kind of tension really between what is the sick note or any kind of capability test actually used for? Is it to help people achieve what they want to achieve, or is it used as some kind of disciplining procedure? And of course, throughout history, it's been both.
We talk about the sick note becoming the fifth note in 2010. What did that transition mean? That was Gordon Brown, I think, who brought that in. What was the meaning of that in ideological terms?
The logic of the time was actually, why don't we do something that's a little bit more constructive than that? Why don't we have people who need help go to their doctor or to some other medical professional and get some kind of report on what they can do, rather than having this binary between you can't work or you can work? But of course, when the Great Recession happens at the end of the 2000s, then those tests start to become a little bit more useful to the government as a punitive measure. And New Labour does some of that in the Brown years. That really accelerates then once Cameron becomes Prime Minister and Ian Duncan Smith is in charge of the DWP.
Gareth, I must admit, when I first saw the title of your book, I thought, how on earth could anybody write a book about the sick note? You've done it. Let me just turn to your final chapter, The Death of the Sick Note, it's called, and you put a question mark after that. I suppose we should also take into account the impact of the COVID pandemic.
COVID was, I hate to say this, but quite well timed for somebody trying to write a book about the sick note. It did keep everything front and centre of everybody's mind. So we are going to continue to need to have some kind of system of being able to say whether somebody can or can't work. Even for people that have been proposing quite radical changes to the economy in terms of things like the universal basic income. Even if we're going to maintain employment and people get paid a minimum basic income, employers are still going to want to know whether you're going to turn up or whether you're actually able to do that work today or tomorrow or in the next day. And as we've seen through COVID, we've all been sticking sticks up our noses and waggling them on the back of our tonsils to try and see whether we're allowed to work. I think it's here to stay.
In your words, the idea of the sick note isn't going anywhere. Gareth Millward, thank you very much. Oh yes, I should tell you, this is the last programme in the current series of Thinking Aloud. We'll be back on air again on December the 21st, in good time to season your Christmas festivities with an acerbic spoonful of sociological analysis. Now, 3 weeks ago, a neighbour thoughtfully asked me if I'd had my COVID booster. Well, I told him I planned to visit the doctor in the very near future. Don't bother with all that palaver, he said. There's this little place round the corner from Old Street where they'll do it for you on the spot. Well, I duly followed his instructions and found myself in a side street and the closed door of some sort of annex. And outside this door, two men were seated on rickety chairs. COVID booster, I inquired. 5 minutes later, I was let into the little unfurnished room behind the closed door and duly jabbed by a man who, although perfectly efficient and courteous, seemed to treat the whole matter rather as a technocratic job rather than a medical procedure. But it wasn't very NHS, I told my wife when I got home. Since then I've been reading a new article which has given added resonance to my casual remark. Its very title conveys the ambiguity I was feeling. I'm afraid, there's no NHS. Its author is Sally Sheard, who's Professor of Modern History at the University of Liverpool, and Sally's article appears in a book edited by Jennifer Crane and Jane Hurd entitled Posters, Protests and Prescriptions, A Cultural History of the National Health Service in Britain. Let's start, Sally, with the enigmatic title of your chapter, this strange comma that you've inserted there. What were you hoping to convey?
I wanted to explore how we refer to the National Health Service in the UK from a historical perspective, but also to acknowledge a very real sense of crisis over its current state and potential future. Of course, next year is the 75th anniversary of the NHS. So thinking back to before its creation in 1948, in all of the discourse was around a National Health Service. The title was always referred to in full. And the Act of Parliament has that. All of the paperwork that comes out after the creation of the NHS mentions the National Health Service. And it's not until the 1960s that we get to this introduction of the acronym NHS, and it progressively takes over, but nobody really comments on it at the time. It signifies the service has become central to British life. It's almost like a nickname, and then if you track it through something like a Google Ngram, you can see that by the time we get into the 2000s, there is so much more discussion in the media about the NHS. We wouldn't talk about it though in terms of our individual interactions with it. We wouldn't say, I've got an NHS appointment tomorrow. We'd say, I've got a GP appointment, or I've got a hospital appointment. But there's, I think, a clear increase in awareness of the NHS as part of our national infrastructure that happens particularly sort of from the 2000s onwards, a little bit like the BBC.
It's a fascinating idea to, as you were, have a cultural history of the NHS.
What I was interested in doing with this article was looking at those signifiers, symbols, about how it's become part of our tradition, some of the language involved, how we consider hierarchies, authority within the NHS. And I think here you can begin to see some of those early signs of malaise that perhaps don't get picked up through policy histories until a little bit later. So one example would be the Mid-Staffordshire Hospital crisis that led to a public inquiry. If you talk to staff, if you talk to patients in the lead up to that, they would probably have said it's just a feeling that something's not quite right here. But it wasn't enough, obviously, for the officials to go in early and sort of say, we know something's wrong, we've got to change it. So I'm interested in looking at how we begin to collect and then use these more ephemeral sides of history of the NHS.
And one of the ephemeral aspects that you want to talk about is the way the NHS represents itself through its various dress codes.
If you were to ask somebody of the more mature years to immediately say what comes into their mind when you say the word doctor to them, they would probably, a lot of them would still say a white male in a white coat. But for the younger generation, it's people in scrubs, there's sort of pyjama suits that we've probably more associated with American healthcare systems and we've imported into the NHS. Nurses' uniforms have changed as well. So when the NHS started, it was very hierarchical, different colours of uniforms, different styles of hats. They had things called frillies, these incredibly towering things, starched headdresses, and it's been useful that you have to be able to identify who is in charge very quickly in an acute hospital environment. But there's been a slow transition that I think is a very interesting one, and it mimics how we've moved as well into what we're called now multidisciplinary teams, MD teams, in which the doctor may not always be the person who is in charge.
It is a highly visible aspect of the NHS, the logos, the uniforms and so on. But you also mention the reverse side, the invisibility, the relative invisibility of public health and primary care. What do you mean exactly?
Well, public health is both a discipline and a practice. It has moved in and out of the NHS since 1948. It was initially left with its historic home in local government and then came into the NHS only in 1974 and was moved back out again to local government in 2012. They've never had the distinct sort of physical infrastructure around where they work, like hospitals and surgeries. They haven't had the equivalent of equipment or dress as their clinical colleagues. It's been quite hard to see public health within the NHS, and their position in the hierarchy has also been quite lowly, and my public health colleagues would be referred to as the drains doctors still, even relatively recently. I think primary care has had a similar imagery problem, perversely, because it's the part of the NHS that the public has the most contact with through their interactions with GPs. So when the NHS was created, general practitioners mainly worked from their homes. Their surgery was their front parlour, and their wife was quite often their receptionist come secretary. And there's that domestic imagery around primary care that has been perpetuated quite deliberately. So even when we have the creation of purpose-built healthcare centres from the 1960s and 1970s, where we bring general practitioners together to work in group practices, they carry over some of that imagery quite deliberately from the domestic setting. Armchairs, fish tanks, magazines. They want the patient to feel relaxed. They want to have that very personal one-to-one interaction in a comfortable, safe environment.
Now, you're already interestingly making the point that we shouldn't look at the NHS as a monolith. I mean, you want to talk about it as really a composite of hundreds of diverse parts. Why do you think you need to take that perspective in order that we can go on talking about universal national health care?
Our personal engagement with the NHS is usually with the most local components of it. We talk about our GP, our hospital. There's a sense of ownership, responsibility, mutual support, dependence almost. And there's, I think, tremendous political capital in that relationship. And we've seen that recently through campaigns like, keep our NHS public, save our NHS. And politicians will quite often talk about our NHS. They never say, the NHS. So there's a greater value, I think, to seeing it at a local level. And for those who want to maintain this universal health coverage system where it's tax funded, free at the point of use, it's important that we both see it as local components but also as part of a multifunctional national system. The most common reference point is the human system, and that's been used a lot, particularly around NHS anniversaries, particularly around the 70th anniversary in 2018. Reference to the biblical human life expectancy of 70 years and 10, and the NHS has got to that biblical life expectancy. Should we be expecting it to continue any longer? Is it now on life support? Is it in need of critical care? So the human metaphor is quite helpful politically, but I think there are other metaphors that are more interesting to look at, and one I use in the article is the metaphor of an octopus. I think an octopus is probably better than a human because it has three hearts, which I think represent Westminster, Whitehall, and then the front line, the actual delivery, the people out there in the hospitals and the GP. It has the ability to regrow parts, to regenerate. It's an incredibly intelligent organism, which I think the NHS is. I think we can be quite creative with the ways in which we use metaphors when discussing what the NHS is and what the NHS means to us as a public.
If we talk about a way of understanding the evolution and history of the NHS, you want to suggest that certain ways of telling the history have various limitations.
History's been used quite extensively in the recent discussion around the future of the NHS. We hark back to a history of efficient hospitals with those imageries that we talked about earlier of the white-coated doctor and the nurses with their frilly hats. There is no such thing as the history of the NHS. There is only histories, and they need to be based on robust evidence. And there's a wealth of material about the administrative side of the NHS, how it functions. But even that, I think, can be deliberately misrepresented. Even the stories about the creation of the NHS can be spun in very different ways. And we saw this, the Conservative Party conference when Therese Coffey said that the NHS had been created by a Conservative minister, which is actually wrong. But I think what we need to do is think about how we use different types of history in different ways. We need to think about what it's meant to the public, to politicians, and for me, oral history has huge potential to enrich some of those quite dry, administrative approaches. But there are risks with oral history. They tie us into individual accounts, individual memories, could be very positive or very negative. And there are biases in that. And the risk, I think, is that it holds us to an image of the NHS that may not be terribly helpful. If we want to continue to preserve the NHS now, it limits how we could see the potential for reform, for a new vision of a new style of NHS.
I suppose we've really got to now deal with the pandemic. That did arouse all sorts of fears about the capacity of the NHS to cope, or the future of the NHS, didn't it?
One of the main fears that has come out from COVID is, what capacity do we have in the system for these exceptional additional demands? And those initial stories that we had at the start of the COVID pandemic about would we have to ration access to intensive care treatments based on age or multi-morbidities, they brought forward these fears, these implicit fears that there is perhaps already a two-tier health system operating in the UK.
And you quote the cultural critic and writer Susan Sontag, who once said we have a dual citizenship in the kingdom of the well and the kingdom of the sick. And as you point out, thousands have spent more time in the latter kingdom since February 2020. Let's talk about the ways in which COVID has shifted our perception of what the NHS is, and if you like, where it is.
I think at the start of the pandemic, that really abrupt transition from being able to go into the physical spaces of the NHS, into our GP surgeries, into our hospitals, and that transition to having telephone or Zoom consultations, it further broke down this association of the NHS with the physical infrastructure. It also broke down that convention that the patient and the physician have to be in the same room, and it demonstrated that there are different ways to deliver healthcare services, some of them probably more efficient than the traditional ways within the NHS. But if we're making it more efficient, are we at the same time diminishing its security as an organisation if we lose contact with some of those sights, sounds, smells, the waiting room, the sort of antibacterial whiff, the chat, and is it opening up the potential for a mixed economy of healthcare that we had before 1948? So should we see the NHS as maybe just a 74, 75 year interlude in a much longer progressive history of how we have healthcare in Britain?
Sally Shear, thank you very much. Oh, the last word this week from an early Christmas cracker. Man on phone to boss. I can't come in today. I'm coming up with something. Boss, don't you mean coming down with something? Man, yeah, but I'm still coming up with what I'm coming down with.
Thinking Aloud is presented by Laurie Taylor and produced by Jane Edgerton.
On BBC Radio 4, a number of people at the school had collapsed. Sideways, the series which takes a closer look at the world to unlock new understanding.
A term like hysteria draws the attention from the individual to the broader ideas that shape us.
In the first episode, I'll be discovering how our desire to understand the unexplained can lead us to ignore greater truths.
You could at this point say, hang on a second, I'm getting a bit anxious here. Or you say, oh my God, this is happening to me.
The new series of Sideways with me, Matthew Side, starts next Wednesday at 4 on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds.
Now on Radio 4, as the BBC marks a century of broadcasting, Katie Russell looks back at its earliest days in the media show.
Hello, this is London Calling. If you tuned your Marconi set correctly on the 14th of November 1922 and lived within about 30 miles of Oxford Circus in London, those are the words you would have heard as if by magic as the very first official broadcast of the brand new British Broadcasting Company hit the airwaves. 100 years later, we're looking back at those earliest days. Why was the BBC formed? What was its purpose? And what are the parallels between now and then? I'm joined by Mark Damazer, who was an executive at the BBC for more than 30 years, including as controller of Radio 4. Jean Seaton, Professor of Media History at the University of Westminster and an official historian of the BBC. Paul Carenza, broadcaster on BBC Radio Surrey and Radio Sussex, and producer of the podcast British Broadcasting Century, which tells the story of the BBC from the beginning. And Emily Bell, founding director of the Towle Centre for Digital Journalism at Columbia Journalism School. Welcome to you all. And Paul, as part of your podcast, you reconstructed that very first BBC broadcast. Let's hear a clip to begin with.
Hello. This is 2LO calling. 2LO calling. This evening's broadcast will consist of a weather report, followed by a news bulletin, which will be read first at a standard speed. It will then be repeated at a slower speed. It may be the case that I will read too slowly for people to remember the context. I'm interested to discover whether listeners in would prefer the bulletin to be read once slowly, or once fast and once slowly, or even whether the preference is for it to be read fast twice. First, copyright news from Reuters, Press Association, Exchange and Central News. Polling in the general election takes place tomorrow. The Prime Minister, Mr. Bonar Law, made his final election speech.
Absolutely love that. What we heard there was a result of a huge amount of negotiation between the radio manufacturers, newspapers and the government. Jean, where did the idea come from for one public broadcaster?
It comes out of the government's distaste for the sort of muddle of lots of broadcasters. It partly comes out of anxiety about America, where people were already finding it very difficult to hear each other because they were sort of, clashing. And it comes out actually of a security anxiety that some of the spectrum that was being used for broadcasting was needed for proper purposes, for sort of soldiers and armies to communicate, not this kind of frivolous stuff. So you wanted to control the range of broadcasting. So it comes, as it were, technologically and commercially out of those impulses. But the impulse, nobody understands that it's going to be significant, and indeed the newspapers would have been far more aggressive if they hadn't just seen it as a kind of useful prank to advertise them.
Interesting. Paul, at this point, when this was set up, this British Broadcasting Company, how new was radio as a technology?
Well, it's been around for a while, but it's been essentially a one-to-one service for some time, and even Marconi himself couldn't really see, couldn't see a way to earn money, I think, from making it a one-to-many service. And so I think it's a gradual thing, and it comes slightly from the American influence as well, but really this idea, and for Arthur Burrows, who was that first voice of the BBC, wrote this pitch essentially in 1918 that actually we could use this technology, this one-to-one radio service, to send concerts and political speeches into not just the press rooms, which was his original intention, but then into people's homes if they have the right equipment. So it takes time, I think, for all of that to build up.
And Jean, in terms of the role of the government in the formation of the BBC, did the government fairly quickly recognise its potential as a propaganda tool?
There was a sort of lurking anxiety. We just come through the First World War, very formative actually in the end, but also there'd been the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. So there was an anxiety about how people might be communicating, and there was certainly an anxiety somewhere else, which was that the First World War had been hugely disruptive. All of these people that are working in the new BBC either come from the technology of the war, they've flown aeroplanes, or they've been damaged by the war and they really don't like what the war did. So for the government, it's about putting it in a box and controlling it so that it doesn't get out of hand.
Emily, when we talk about the government, how important was it that the government made this choice to create a single public broadcaster? Because obviously if you fast forward many decades to the internet, clearly the opposite approach looks like it was taken as the internet started to take off.
Yes, well, as Jean was saying, that you have this design not to be like America, and America very much went down the let the market decide, let any broadcaster attract the largest audience, and let's see where it goes. And it's interesting when you contrast it with the commercial internet, which actually started in many ways as a public good. So when Tim Berners-Lee devised the World Wide Web, which is really the navigation system that we all use around the internet, he said, this is a public good, it should be for everybody.
And he's spoken publicly, hasn't he, about how disappointed he has been since.
Exactly, and I think that there was a moment there where you could have theoretically continued with a much more sort of public service type internet, but actually what's happened is it's becoming closed by some of the largest commercial entities in the world, and nearly all of them are based in America. And so we've seen in a way what happens when you have a communication system which is given over to the free market, and there's a very different outcome to the outcome you had with the BBC, maybe inevitably so.
Mark?
So every BBC executive down the years has been tortured by critics who say that they've done something that would make John Reith, the founder of this enterprise, turn in his grave. I always used to think that was something for compliment. I mean, Reith was a monster. He was an extremely violently tempered, homophobic, racist terror of a bloke. But he had this one big idea. And although I felt flattered to feel that he might be turning in his grave and I'd done something that shocked him, I also knew for that one big idea, which is that broadcasting, radio would have a public purpose, all the rest of us should be enormously grateful. Because without that one founding idea, we would be in a very, very different media ecology to the one that was subsequently established in the UK.
One of the most significant inventions in this early period was the licence fee, which provoked fiery debate in Parliament. Here is a clip of Peter Eckersley, one of the BBC's first employees and broadcasters, talking about it.
Yes, it was rather an effort to persuade people to buy licenses. And I can remember a species of evangelicism on my part. I used to go down to these various places in the town halls and give talks to these masses of listeners who came there. And there came a period in my talk when I said, of course it was decided that the revenue of the BBC should be derived from people who paid their 10-shilling licenses. Is that news to you? Then I used to put my hand here and say, is it right that others should pay for your... Is it British? Is it fair? Besides which, we've got a detector van.
A detector van, there you go. Paul, just give us some context. How did the licence fee come into being? How did it work?
Well, this is actually one of the very last things to come into place before the BBC began, because to fund this, and this is the problem that Marconi had to begin with, how do you pay for all of this? And once you have these wireless manufacturers coming together to form this one company so that they can essentially sell radio sets, you then need to somehow fund this broadcasting company to do this. And so there's a royalty paid on all of the sets that are sold. But unfortunately, it turns out actually most people just make their own sets. And so in the first year or so, at least, in the first few years, most of the listeners are not able to even buy a set or to even buy a license, essentially, because they are just making their own radios at home. And therefore, there's a bit of a funding issue immediately. So the license fee instantly didn't bring in as much as they hoped it would.
Interesting that the licence fee clearly has been a political issue for many, many years, and it turns out, in fact, a century. One of the MPs arguing against it at the time was William Benn, father of Tony Benn. Here's an exchange between him and the Postmaster General Frederick Kellaway, as written up in Hansard, the parliamentary site. Captain William Benn says, how are you going to prevent evasion? And Mr. Kellaway says, if I were to explain how I intend to prevent evasion, it would make evasion easier. Jean, Ben argued that it was an unenforceable protectionist system, was it?
Well, it both was, and it was a valuable one. So the licence fee suited the post office. I think one needs to remember that the post office was a very big organisation, much bigger than now.
And the General Post Office was involved in this.
Absolutely. And the post office looked like the natural person to sort of deal with this new bit of technology, because it was already dealing with all sorts of wireless things. And you could pay a licence at the post office, and everywhere there was a post office. So paying a licence fee somehow fitted into a set of bureaucratic habits and possibilities. And the post office took a lot of the licence fee.
Mark, as someone who knows the BBC inside and out, was it a good system? Is it a good system?
Well, the licence fee has spawned its own mythology, its story, its controversy, it goes on. But the key propulsive force of the BBC is not the licence fee. It's this idea that Jean was just articulating, which is universality. It's the fact that we all own it, and we more or less all pay for it, and that we always have done. And it gives us a unique stake in it. We can dislike it, we can hate it, we can love it, we can do all of those things at the same time. And it's our entitlement because we own it.
But it is also, therefore, the BBC's responsibility to provide a universal service.
But of course, and it has to do enough of value for all the various people, millions upon millions, who pay the licence fee to justify it. That's of course true. But one, it gives you that sense of ownership. It doesn't belong to the government. It certainly doesn't belong to the BBC management at any given period. It belongs to all of us. And the second thing it gives you, in this case through the licence fee, at least until this point, is economies of scale. The fact that we all pay for it means that we get much more out of it than if it was only there for people who could afford to pay it, because you'd end up getting much less value for money.
Okay, and Emily, I mean, the licence fee has survived fairly precariously for 100 years. Do you think it will survive another 100, even another 10?
Well, it certainly doesn't feel that way, because again, it is this very contested political football, and we know that the current government has expressed some desire to get rid of the licence fee, says it's very old-fashioned, doesn't really work in the age of, we keep hearing about Netflix, etc. But the point to make is that all of those ways are flawed. And you could make a case that says that even though it is a very peculiar anomaly and it is awkward, that it's actually more durable than an advertising system, which we've seen can be extremely volatile, and also it can create monopolies and duopolies, as it has with Facebook and Google. And you also have problems with direct subscription services, because, as Mark says, it cuts off universality and the idea of common ownership. And it also means that you get a quality of information which is arguably of a higher level, that going to those people who pay versus those people who can't pay. So whilst it's very politically contested at the moment, there are real, I think, merits in this idea of common ownership.
Well, news has been at the heart of the BBC for 100 years. As we heard, the first broadcast was a news bulletin, but there was a lot of debate about reading the news on the radio. Paul, what did the newspapers object to back then?
Well, there was this battle really between the news and the broadcasters about the ownership of the news. Essentially, newspapers felt that this was their domain, really. And even going back 2.5 years before the BBC began, with the very first test broadcast, when they used to read out railway timetables and things like that, just to try and test out the technology, and people were listening in, but then people were complaining, going, well, actually these railway timetables are all very well, not realising it's just a test. Can you read something more interesting? So they would read the newspaper, and even then the press got involved and was saying, well, actually, could you read yesterday's newspaper, because we don't want you giving away the news for free, essentially. So the legacy of that then, I think, comes through into when the BBC formed, and they have to wrestle this deal whereby they'll only broadcast the news after 7 o'clock in the evening, and they can't edit the news. They will just read what they are essentially given from Reuters and the press agencies like that. So it's a tentative dance to begin with.
And if we're talking about commercial concerns, Mark, what do you think the relationship is like now between the BBC and its commercial competitors? I mean, there've been, obviously, when it comes to talent, a number of high-profile defections, for example, to LBC and others. Do you think the BBC is still seen as a threat to others, or is it the other way around?
The BBC is, above all, a talent organisation. If it can't attract talent in all the various different places it needs it, for all its various different audiences, there's no point to it. So the question you have to ask is whether we've reached a tipping point, and whether the BBC's relative decline in resources over the last few years means it can no longer establish itself and be seen as the nation's #1 talent organisation. Well, I think it still is. But I don't yelp with success that all these people are leaving. I think some of them are leaving because they're better paid elsewhere. And I think that there will come a point where tough decisions need to be made in order to pay people to keep them, unfashionable though that may be with both politicians and some people who are not well off who pay the licence fee. The BBC must have a huge range of great talent, as well as encouraging young talent as part of its alchemy. It's always done it up to now. I think it's still in a position to do it, but it's more fragile than it's ever been.
Emily Bell?
Yeah, I think that when you look at the range of competition, you look particularly, I mean, this is not something that's just happening to the BBC as well. I would say it's happening to every single media organisation, which is individuals now can go out, and whether it's through podcasting or newsletters or whatever it is, the individual can be bigger than the media brand or the institution, or at least that's the feeling, or the way the market is moving. It is definitely the case that we are going to need institutional strength when it comes to news broadcast, when it comes to developing talent and cultural assets, if I can use that rather academic phrase, because that's not going to be provided, I think, by the free market. And we don't like to think of the BBC just as providing a patch for market failure. But this idea that Britain is somehow, Britain is the creative economy, and the BBC is sat at the heart of that creative economy for quite a long time. And I do think that it's really important, as Mark says, that that people recognise and maintain that, because it's not just a cultural driver. In a way, it's an economic driver for the rest of the creative businesses in Britain.
Okay, well, let's go back 100 years again. Day one of the BBC was General Election Day, which was an exciting day to launch. On day two came the first broadcast from 5IT in Birmingham and 2ZY in Manchester. Around that time, as it started, maybe 20 to 30,000 licenses were out there. There were listening parties of 50 or more. But Paul, what were they broadcasting? We've heard about news, bit of weather, but what were they broadcasting, and why did those ones in Manchester and Birmingham not start the same day as the London one?
The Birmingham station was a little slow to start because they were simply moving all of the equipment from London and it got lost in fog, so they would have started a little earlier if maybe the weather was more clement. And then it's really day three, I think it actually properly kicks off. November the 16th, you start to have musical concerts. The first song of the BBC, proper, I suppose, is Leonard Hawke with Drake Goes West, and then it's light opera and comedians, essentially from 7 until close down at 10:30 or so.
And Mark earlier mentioned John Reith. He's the name that we associate with the early days of the BBC, but you argue two other men were very important in shaping the BBC, Peter Eckersley, and who we've already heard from, and Arthur Burrows. Who were they?
Well, Arthur Burrows, then, they both worked for Marconi Company, but different wings, and I think both have very different ideas of what broadcasting could or should be. So Arthur Burrows had this rather high-minded approach and wanted poetry and light opera and readings and things like this. But whatever Arthur Burrows was on air in the sort of the experimental stages in the summer of 1922, doing these poetry readings and the like, Peter Eckersley was on a rival station that was just there ahead of the London station in Essex, 2MT Writtle. And so Arthur Burrows inaugurates the first time signals, really, with the chimes that you heard at the start there, the tubular bells in the studio. And the next night, Peter Eckersley goes to the scrap metal dealerships and gets all the pots and pans and broken glass and just bashes them and sort of just mocks whatever they do in London, really. So I like that idea that from that you already get that sense that the BBC can give you the greater, the higher things and news and important things, but it can also give you a little bit of mocking British sense of humour in there as well.
I think we can hear a little clip from Arthur Burrows now.
One cannot recall those early days without smiling. There was something big, even colossal, conveyed in the nature of the contract we had undertaken. Nobody could tell to what extent broadcasting would catch on, nor indeed whether it would take on at all. There was no precedent, no store of experience to be tapped, no staff ready to hand with metal proved in a similar field. It was all left to us. And now, in 1937, the broadcast program 50 million persons.
I can with one topic. The collectibles, I don't know if you read, it was in the papers this week, and you've got a connection to her in a way. Debbie McGee is selling off some of Paul Daniels' Magic Act memorabilia.
Right.
Yeah. And also, we were talking about Blues Brothers earlier.
Yeah.
Now, if memory serves me out, I might be wrong. I connected Star Wars in that Carrie Fisher starred in the Blues Brothers as well as Star Wars. So there you go.
Well, look at that. There you go, Rashid.
Freaky, isn't it?
Nonsense we didn't know.
Anyway,
but I love that, yeah. Yes.
Lady, I've
What
got
do you
a
think?
6, 3 7s, an 8, and a 9 for you.
Oh, just give me the 9. It's too depressing, Rashid. It's too depressing.
Oh, the 8 was a good one. I had Spinster. I'm thinking of Lady Havisham.
Spinster. I'm not a spinster yet.
And the 9, it's a lovely word. Think spiders and the webs and the fine silk. Spinnerets.
Spinnerets. You've killed me, Rashida, as ever.
Sadie.
Christine in Burnham, what did you get, Christine? Come on.
I thought I'd done well, but after Rashid, I got painters the same as that. I got an 8. I got painters.
Well
and